Today we move away from public spaces to sculpture, along with temples, the art that for most of us defines what Greek art really means. The first image that the College Board requires is the Anavisos Kouros from the Archaic period. But Greek sculpture begins much earlier. Sculptures such as the hero and centaur, which you've already seen, are much more stylized and triangular, yet already they show some of the characteristics that would set Greek sculpture apart, including nudity. Well, apparently AP art history students don't need to know this anymore, but the hero and the centaur is an example of what is called the geometric period in Greek art, and it's from just when Greece is emerging from its dark ages. When we move forward about a century to a time when the Greeks are renewing trade with the Near East, we see more Eastern elements enter Greek art. This is a lintel, remember what that is? From a Greek temple. That's the beam above the doorway. Take a look at the headdresses, which resemble Egyptian figures, and note, too, the profile animals with twisted perspective. But what really strikes me is how motionless and static these figures are. That's about to change. So what evolution in Greek art do you observe in this Orientalizing period sculpture? Well, we see more interest in human anatomy, such as a hint of pectoral and abdominal muscles. The figure is also clearly designed to be viewed in the round. But we still see remains of the geometric period. The torso remains triangular, and surely that impressive butt is a little too spherical to be realistic. So what does the placement of hands indicate about the sculpture's likely function? It was holding a votive offering. Note that unlike the Sumerian votive statues shown here, the hands extend out into space. And this is another important innovation. Art historians use the term negative space to describe basically the area around a statue. You've met that term in your textbook. Most Near Eastern sculpture makes relatively little use of negative space. The figures are self-contained, basically carved out of a single block of wood or stone with very little airspace. Greek sculptured figures are beginning to reach into the space around them, both to indicate movement and maybe to indicate a connection with the wider world. Kore is female, Kouros is male, right? You need to keep those terms straight. We're still in the Orientalizing period, the one you don't really need to know, but we're seeing some movement toward more realistic human figures. This Kore is more tubular than triangular, which comes a little closer to the actual human shape, although the figure is still stylized and geometric. What facial expression does she have? Well, she's smiling, but it's that rather strange, mysterious smile that art historians call the archaic smile, since it shows so much in archaic sculpture. But actually, it's characteristic of this earlier period as well, and it's an indication that this is a transitional work. Note that she's wearing clothes. Men in Greek sculpture are usually depicted in the nude, but women are clothed until a much later period, except sometimes goddesses, who for some reason occasionally get to run around in the buff. You've covered all this in your reading, but just to connect the art you're seeing now with that history, we're looking at art from the period when Athens is becoming a major commercial power in the Mediterranean, and when it's developing the system of direct, not representative, but direct democracy that we talked about when we looked at the Agora. So how does this early Kouros, we still haven't gotten to your required works, how does this early Kouros represent a further development in Greek sculpture? And I've contrasted it here with the Orientalizing sculpture that we just looked at. Well, the torso of the Kouros is still triangular, but less unnaturally so. The legs have more musculature and a more realistic shape, and the neck is no longer stylized and elongated. The butt now looks like something he could actually sit on. And finally, I get to one of our required works, and I hope you now see why I felt I really needed to show you the earlier statues and the evolution of Greek sculpture over the previous 200 years. I think that just starting off with this guy would give you a misleading impression. This Kouros, too, acted as a grave marker. We know from the inscription that the subject was a young man who died in battle. But how does this later Kouros show further development in Greek sculpture as compared with the New York Kouros that we just looked at and that I've put here on the left? Well, we still see some of that triangular shape, stylized hair, and archaic smile, but still the figure is more natural. The head is better proportioned, the planes of the head are not as flat, The hips are more rounded. Some of the original paint remains on this statue. Encaustic, which is another vocabulary word you should know, is pigment mixed with hot wax and applied to the statue while it's still hot. It's actually quite tough to get paint to adhere to stone, and this is the most common technique. This difficulty with adhering paint to stone is the reason why only flecks of paint on these statues remain. Now, I'm pretty sure that the College Board chose Menkure and Queen rather than Khafre as the required Old Kingdom sculpture image, precisely because it invited the comparison between these two works. So let's take up that invitation. What similarities and differences do you observe? There are actually a lot of similarities. The figures are both frontal and bilaterally symmetrical. Although the left foot is moving forward, the rest of the body remains rigidly upright. Try it. You can't do it unless somehow you were unlucky enough to be born with a left leg that's longer than your right leg. The hair is stylized. The fists are clenched. Still, we see some very important differences. The Greek sculpture is nude, but we also see more defined musculature. Menkure is built, but he isn't boasting a six-pack like our Kouros. Note, too, that we don't see Menkure from the rear. He backs into stone. Our Kouros was created to be seen in the round. Nice view. A kore is female, right? So what gave the peplos kore, which we see here on the left, another required work, what gave it her this name? Well, peplos was the name for her woolen belted garment. But as you heard on the Khan Academy video, there's actually some dispute over whether the outfit she's wearing actually is a peplos. And also, it's interesting to note that by the time this was sculpted, the peplos was really out of fashion. There's also some dispute over the function of this statue. Many of the kore found on the Acropolis were votive statues. Remember the Sumerian votive statues and the Greek statue you just saw? In other words, they were representing offerings to a goddess, often Athena. They were much smaller than the life-size or larger than life-size Kouros grave markers we've just seen. That's actually something that's hard to see on a slide. But there are good reasons to think that this statue, the one on the left, was not an offering to a goddess, but was a goddess herself. Her dress is deliberately old-fashioned. Other than other kore on the Acropolis, like the one I've put here on the right, were more dressed up, more fashionable. Some scholars think this similar costume was one that was associated with the goddess Artemis. Holes in her head and in her right hand suggest that originally she wore a crown and carried something, a spear if she were Athena, an arrow if she were Artemis. And alas, these identifying attributes have gone missing long ago, so we can't be sure. The peplos kore also shows some further advances away from archaic and toward classical sculpture. While her mouth retains the uplifted corners of an archaic smile, it's now much softer, more relaxed, less triangular in form. The more developed form of the eyes corresponds to the equally developed form of the body. She has a real shape under that heavy cloak. Again, we know from traces of paint that the kore and virtually all Greek statues were vividly painted. We're so accustomed to the lovely stark white of Greek marble statues, and I think we find the originals, at least I find the originals, jarring and gaudy. But how might the color have promoted the statue's function? Well, if this were a goddess, it would certainly draw the eye. What we're going to see now is the art of a culture that is supremely confident in itself in the face of a huge victory against a numerically stronger adversary, the Persians, and the victory of a kind of democracy against that enormous empire. Now, the Greeks are going to lose some of this confidence before long, as we'll see, but for now, when I took a course for AP Art History teachers this summer, my instructor got very grumpy about the Critias boy. That's the work on the left being excluded from the College Board's magic list. The College Board list goes straight from the Anavaisos Kouros to Polykleitos' canon. That is, it moves immediately between the two sculptures you see here on the right. So, why do you think the College Board's decision made him grumpy? Why did he call Critias boy the missing link? Well, the Critias boy is the first statue known to use contrapposto. You encountered this term when you read about the Doryphorus over the summer. Contrapposto is an Italian word that we would literally translate as counterpoise. One leg bears the weight while the other is relaxed. When this pose is captured realistically in art, it shows up as a kind of tilt or asymmetry in the figures. An axis or imaginary line that we would draw across the hips and the shoulders. The Greeks described this dynamic counterbalance with the word symmetria, and this is going to be easier to see with diagrams. Let's make these come up. There we go. So here you see our anavisos kouros with lines drawn to show the absence of contrapposto. The body is unnaturally stiff. The shoulders are level. The hips are level. Both fists are level. Even the knees are level, but the left leg is thrust forward, and if this pose were recreated in nature, that left leg would have to be 6 inches longer than the right. Contrapposto first appeared in classic Greek sculpture, again with the Critias boy. These axis lines help illustrate the ways in which the artist captures a more realistic pose. Oops, sorry about that. We will go back. There it goes. So we see the left shoulder is higher than the right shoulder. There's an acute angle formed between the left shoulder and the right hip, which in turn is higher than the left hip. And this is the counterpoise or balance, which is formed by not making the shoulder and hip axes straight or horizontal. The shoulders counterbalance the hips. Also notice how the knees are not level, but instead are angled. The turned and tilted head breaks out of the rigidly frontal pose of the previous statues, and this too adds to the naturalness of the pose. Now, you should know by now from your reading that Polykleitos created this work as a kind of teaching tool to demonstrate the perfect proportions of the human body and how they can be captured in sculpture. Tomorrow in class, you're going to be writing an essay about this canon. Come prepared with notes. But for now, I'm going to throw a few more terms at you and gasp some math. Okay, here we go. See if I can get this to build properly. Chiastic is really a term for symmetria, a balance between flexed or curved and straight lines. Again, a chiastic cross balance where symmetria is deliberately asymmetric, and yet it still shows a kind of symmetry. The right arm and leg are straight, supporting the left side's flexed limbs. The head turns right while the hips twist left, and the back foot turns outward. Overall, this creates a twist and sense of movement in the body. Oops. There goes some more arrows. Now we come to the scary part, the mathematics of perfect proportion. You may recall that the Egyptians used a proportional grid. The Greeks employed more sophisticated mathematics, deriving a ratio, and you see it here put in various mathematical ways, that they believe expressed perfect proportions. Don't bother to write down this whole equation. Just know that it was a mathematical relationship based on the ratio of rectangles. The golden ratio does show up in nature, by the way, and here are just a few illustrations. And on the right, of course, you see the famous Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci. So rather than rely on my now pretty rusty mathematical training, I would like to turn to a real expert to explain first how and why the Greeks became so fascinated with mathematical ratios, and then what this particular ratio means. Let's hear from Donald Duck. Tomorrow, after you take a short quiz and write your essay on Polykleitos' canon, we will turn to Greek temples and see the golden ratio in action on the Acropolis. But for now, let's have a little hands-on practice with using the golden ratio with Greek sculpture. You'll probably figure out from this snip photo that I borrowed this idea from another teacher, one who's more creative than I am. I've instructed Ms. Jacobs to take photos of your masterpieces and send them to me. Enjoy.